All right. So, Democrats who frequently like to put themselves up as the only defenders between the American people and a full blown anti democratic authoritarian takeover by the Republican Party are taking some pretty authoritarian steps themselves recently, especially in the Democratic primary. So, here from Florida Democrats directly. We just officially put Joe Biden on the ballot in Florida 4 more years. Let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this.
4 years! 4 years! 4 years! 4 years!
Okay, so essentially what happened here is you had the Florida Democratic Party that decided they liked Joe Biden personally, and regardless of the polling data that has come out showing that the overwhelming majority of Democrats do not want Joe Biden to run again, they decided that they were going to pick Joe Biden as the only person, the only Democrat who can be on the ballot in the state of Florida for the Democratic primary. Okay, not the general election, for the Democratic primary. Right, so we got this Politico article here that's going to outline it for us. They say Florida Democrats plan to cancel the presidential primary, enraging Dean Phillips campaign. Okay, absolutely gotta love how they only brought up Dean Phillips here in the headline, even though obviously this enraged the other candidates. In fact, the leading candidate besides Joe Biden, somebody like Marianne Williamson, as well as Cenk Uygur as well, who are also in this primary, but they led with Dean Phillips here, right? Now he's, I guess, in the eyes of establishment media outlets, he's more of a respectable candidate maybe in their eyes, so they decided to focus in here on Dean Phillips. But maybe that's part of the reason why it's it's good to have somebody like Dean Phillips in the race, because at least then this kind of shit would get covered, right? Maybe if he wasn't in the race, then they wouldn't have even mentioned that this happened. But they say down here, Florida appears poised to hold no presidential primary election for Democrats this cycle, after the state party submitted only President Joe Biden's name as a candidate up for nomination. Okay, the move to leave Representative Dean Phillips off the primary ballot left the Minnesota Democrat enraged on Thursday. In a statement first provided to Politico, Phillips, who has launched a long-shot primary against Joe Biden, accused the Florida Democratic Party officials of rigging the primary. He threatened a lawsuit and a convention fight if he didn't win ballot access in the state. So, I mean, first of all, he's correct about this, right? I don't agree with Dean Phillips on many of his different policy priorities, but he's 100% correct about this, right? This is absolutely rigging the primary, okay? It would be one thing if you hold the party elections in the primary and Joe Biden wins overwhelmingly, and then, okay, you nominate him as your nominee to lead the ticket, okay? It's an entirely different thing when you just remove the possibility of people within the state of Florida to be able to vote for a different candidate, right? It would also be a different thing if Joe Biden had like a 99% approval rating within the Democratic Party. Maybe then you could say okay, listen, this other person's polling at 0.1%. We don't really need to go through the process of wasting resources on a primary. It's another thing when you have somebody like Joe Biden, who the majority of Democrats do not want to run in 2024. The majority of Democrats want somebody else, okay? Now, the majority of Democrats don't want Dean Phillips, but you also have people like Marianne Williamson again, who's been polling at around 10% recently in some of the polls that I've seen. You have somebody like Cenk Uygur, you have somebody like Dean Phillips, right? And you potentially could have more on the way in the next couple of weeks and months, right? So, I mean, it's not as if Joe Biden is running unchallenged. It's like they're just pretending as if he's running unchallenged and that there aren't other people in his party that want to, pose a challenge for this ticket. Now, I do want to talk about, before we continue in this article here, right, some of the recent polling data. Now, listen, it's not close, okay? You can see here from the RCP average, Biden's up at 68% on average, Marianne 8% or so, Dean Phillips 3% or so, Cenk is probably at 1% or so in these polling data. Now, obviously you have to take this under the consideration that Marianne Williamson and the rest of these candidates have been facing basically a complete and total media blackout throughout the entirety of this race. The entirety of the so-called leftist media, MSNBC, CNN, whatever the case may be, has been pretending as if Marianne Williamson simply does not exist, as if the Democratic primary simply does not exist, right? So it's not as if they've gotten the same media coverage as other politicians have gotten, which is deeply ironic, because if you actually look at the polling data here, even at 8%, which is lower than some of these polls, right? Some of these she's at 13, 12, whatever the percentage may be. Even if she's at 8.4% in the Democratic primary polls, guess what? That's better than somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy. That's better than Mike Pence ever got. That's better than Chris Christie's ever got. That's better than Tim Scott's ever got, right? So Marianne Williamson has been doing better than a vast majority of all of these different Republican politicians in the Republican primary, and yet look at the disparity in the media coverage between somebody like Marianne Williamson versus somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy. You can't even compare the two, right? It's all these Republicans, they're deeply serious challengers, right? They're about to dethrone Donald Trump at any minute in the Republican primary. But somebody like Marianne Williamson, she literally never gets talked about, and the only times that they do talk about the Democratic primary in the mainstream media, they talk about it as if it doesn't exist. They talk about it as if it's a foregone conclusion, and that they don't even need to get into the policy nuances and differences between any of these given candidates. And so we had a response here from Dean Phillips himself, saying, quote, Americans would expect the absence of democracy in Tehran, not in Tallahassee, said Dean Phillips. The intentional disenfranchisement of voters runs counter to everything for which the Democratic Party and our country stand. Our mission as Democrats is to defeat authoritarians, not become them. Well, this is a little lesson here for our boy Dean Phillips. Now, keep in mind, to his own credit, this is a guy who previously, when Bernie Sanders came out and made similar statements and said, they're kind of rigging these elections against me back in 2016, 2020 about the Democratic Party, Dean Phillips was one of the guys who would kind of make fun of him and pretend as if that wasn't really happening. And now that he's in the race himself and he's seeing the games that Democrats play, the Democratic Party for that matter, now he's turning around and he's like, holy fuck, Bernie was 100% right about this. They absolutely are rigging this election process. And so they continue. They say the Phillips campaign complaint is rooted in the process by which candidates can get on the ballot in Florida. Under state law, it is left up to the parties to decide who makes the primary ballot. The deadline for parties to submit a list of approved candidates to state election officials is on Thursday. Today is not Thursday. They say the Florida Democrats acted before that deadline, sending a notice on November 1st to the state that had Biden as the only primary candidate. Phillips had entered the race a few days earlier, and self-help guru Marianne Williamson had been on the campaign for months by then. Under state law, if a party only signs off on one candidate for the primary ballot, the contest is not held. So essentially they looked at somebody like Marianne Williamson, Dean Phillips, the rest of these guys, right? And they were just like, we're just not going to hold a primary. Okay? Now, they went even contrary to their own state party guidelines. Okay? They did this days earlier. And they suggested, oh no, we don't need to even go about the regular process. We're going to do this early. We're not going to give anybody a fair, legitimate chance to get their name on the ballot. We're just going to nominate Joe Biden because that's the guy that we like, and we don't like any of these other challengers. We're not going to leave it up to the will of the people, okay? Even as we're pretending to be the only, vanguard standing in between democracy and authoritarianism in the United States. They just decided we like Joe Biden, so we're going to pick him. And this isn't, again, it's not based on any objective criteria here. It's not based on, okay, you need to meet a 3% or a 5% threshold, or you need to have X amount of donors, in the Democratic Party to be able to reach the threshold to get on the primary ballot, right? It's not based on any objective metric. This is just based on the whims of the Florida Democratic primary, right? And flashback to when Bernie Sanders was running, this was one of the main arguments that they used against him in court, right? The National Democratic Party, the DNC, they made the argument in court that because they are a political party, they have no responsibility to make this a fair competition. They can make this intentionally biased towards a candidate like Hillary over Bernie Sanders, and they have no qualms about it. They don't have to be perfectly neutral. There's no legal responsibility for them to be perfectly neutral. They can rig it in favor of the candidate that they want as the establishment of this party, and that's perfectly fine to them. They continue here. They say Florida's primary is held on March 19th, which puts it behind some of the Super Tuesday and several other large states like California and Texas, and it allocates around 250 delegates. In his statement, Phillips called the handling of the process by the Florida Democrats a blatant act of electoral corruption and demanded that Biden condemn and immediately address it. So good for this guy, Dean Phillips. Again, I don't agree with all of his policies, but fuck the DNC. They say the Biden administration, of course, did not make a comment for this story. Nikki Fried, the chair of the Florida Democratic Party, contended that the party followed its standard process that was outlined on its website. If this is a standard process, then you have some institutional rot that's going on here. Something fundamental is broken about your party rules or guidelines, if this is considered standard process, where you could have somebody like Marianne Williamson who's polling way better than a majority of even the Republican candidates in the Republican primary, and she's not even considered part of the contest, to the point where you're not even putting her name on the ballot. That's fucking crazy. That's just completely fucking absurd. They continue here, quote, we're going to finish off with this. I mean, this quote, Jesus Christ. We are dismayed by Dean Phillips' conspiratorial and inappropriate comments comparing the state of Florida to the Iranian regime as part of his knee-jerk reaction to long-established procedures. This is unbecoming of somebody running for higher office. So this response for Dean Phillips to say that this is an authoritarian measure that you guys are taking right now, okay, because it explicitly is, by definition, because you're not allowing the democratic will of the people to even play a role in the nominating process. You're just picking somebody that you like and ignoring any of the democratic challengers, right? Even though it is objectively authoritarian, they respond and they say this is unbecoming of somebody running for higher office. Unbecoming? What the fuck does that mean? What do you want him to do? What do you want Marianne Williamson to do, right? You want them to just bend over and take it? You want them to just sit back and allow you guys to rig the primary? I mean, in the fullest sense of the word, to rig the Democratic primary in favor of Joe Biden to the point where their names are not even on the ballot? They're just supposed to take that, right? That would be becoming of a presidential candidate for higher office. I mean, seriously, what exactly would you like them to do? I mean, it's just so patently absurd at every single level that you want to look at it. And again, especially for a party that is trying to pretend as if they are the only thing preventing us from falling into full-blown fascism, right? The same party that says that Donald Trump is the greatest authoritarian threat that this country has ever seen, which I actually agree with to a large extent. But if you actually want to be the party that is standing up for democracy, you would think that maybe like step one would be having an actual fair democratic process within your own political party to decide who's going to go up to challenge the authoritarian in 2024.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying